Look, when you think of Australia today, you're probably imagining venomous spiders the size of dinner plates, snakes that could drop you in minutes, and jellyfish that make you wish you'd stayed home. Scary stuff, right? We're talking about a time when this continent wasn't just dangerous, it was the final boss level of planet Earth. A place where literally everything wanted you dead and had the tools to make it happen. So let me set the scene for you. Picture Australia during the Pleistocene epoch. No kangaroos bouncing around for tourist photos. No cuddly koalas sleeping in eucalyptus trees. Instead, you've got a landscape that looks like someone took the African savanna, cranked the difficulty setting to maximum, and then sprinkled in some creatures that evolution designed during a fever dream. The climate was different. Parts of Australia were actually wetter and more lush than today's dusty outback. Thick forests covered regions that are now barren. Massive wetlands stretched across the interior. It was a paradise, sure, but paradise with a body count. This is where our story really kicks off, because something absolutely wild was happening on this isolated continent. See, Australia had been cut off from the rest of the world's landmasses for millions of years. It was doing its own thing, cooking up its own special brand of nightmare fuel without any input from the rest of the planet. And when you isolate a place for that long, evolution gets creative, really creative, uncomfortably creative. Enter the megafauna. Now, when scientists say megafauna, they're being polite. What they actually mean is animals that would make modern elephants look like house pets. We're talking about creatures that redefined what it meant to be at the top of the food chain. The undisputed heavyweight champion of this era was Megalania, and Bro was a unit. Imagine a Komodo dragon. But instead of being 6 to 10 feet long, this absolute monster stretched 23 feet from snout to tail and weighed over 1,000 pounds. That's longer than most cars. This thing wasn't just a lizard, was a land crocodile with legs, patrolling the forests like some prehistoric gangster enforcing territory. But here's where it gets spicy. Megalania wasn't just big and scary. Recent research suggests this beast was venomous. Yeah, you heard that right. As if being the size of a boat wasn't enough, Mother Nature decided to give it toxic saliva that would cause massive blood loss and prevent clotting. It would bite you once, then just follow you around while you slowly bled out. Talk about playing the long game. The thing could take down prey 3 times its size just by being patient and laced with poison. Short kings everywhere could never. And Megalania wasn't working alone. The skies above were patrolled by eagles that make modern raptors look like sparrows. We're talking about birds with wingspans reaching nearly 10 feet, swooping down to snatch up prey that weighed more than a human child. Imagine walking through an ancient Australian forest and having to worry about aerial attacks from birds big enough to consider you a menu item. The ground, the trees, the sky, nowhere was safe. But wait, it gets better. Let me introduce you to the marsupial lion, Thylacoleo carnifex, whose species name literally means pouched lion executioner, because of course it does. This wasn't technically a lion, it was a marsupial, more closely related to wombats and kangaroos than to any cat. But evolution said, you know what would be hilarious? Let's take a wombat's cousin and turn it into an apex predator. The result was a killing machine, with the strongest bite force relative to body size of any mammal ever recorded. Its teeth weren't designed for quick kills. They were designed for shearing through flesh and crushing bone. It had retractable claws like a cat could probably climb trees, and hunted with the precision of a modern big cat, but with none of the mercy. Now here's where the story takes a turn, because you might be thinking, okay, scary animals, but they're just animals, right? Wrong. The real catalyst that made Australia the deadliest place on Earth wasn't just the monsters, it was the ecosystem they created. See, when you have predators this massive and this efficient, the entire food web becomes a pressure cooker. Everything evolves to either kill better or avoid being killed better. There's no middle ground, no chill, just constant, unrelenting natural selection operating at maximum intensity. The herbivores weren't exactly pushovers either. Diprotodon, the largest marsupial that ever lived, was basically a wombat the size of a rhinoceros, weighing 3 tons. 3 tons. Picture a modern wombat, then multiply it by about 100. These things were wandering around in herds, probably doing wombat things, but at a scale that would shake the ground when they moved. And then there were the giant kangaroos, not cute, skippy energy, but muscular, 7-foot-tall monsters that probably could have punched a hole through your chest if they felt like it. Let me paint you a specific picture of what a day in Pleistocene Australia looked like. The sun rises over a wetland ecosystem. A herd of Diprotodon are grazing near the water's edge, their massive bodies creating small earthquakes with each step. In the trees, a marsupial lion watches, waiting. It's not interested in the adults, too big, too risky. But there's a juvenile separated from the herd. That's the target. Meanwhile, in the shallows, a massive freshwater crocodile, much larger than today's versions, is also watching the same herd. Competition is fierce. Resources are contested. Death is always one miscalculation away. And here's the twist that makes this whole thing even crazier. These animals weren't struggling, they were thriving. This wasn't some post-apocalyptic wasteland where life was barely hanging on. This was evolution's masterpiece, a fully functional ecosystem operating at peak efficiency. The deadliest place on Earth was also one of the most successful. The megafauna weren't evolutionary mistakes, they were power-ups perfectly adapted to their environment. But then something happened. About 50,000 years ago, a new player entered the Australian continent. Humans. Now, here's where we need to pump the brakes on the usual narrative. For a long time, scientists pointed fingers at humans and said, "You guys ruined everything. You hunted all these magnificent creatures to extinction." And sure, humans definitely played a role. But the real story is way more complex and way more interesting. Climate change was already hammering Australia. The continent was drying out. Those lush forests and extensive wetlands were shrinking. Fire regimes were changing. The ecosystem that had supported these giants for millions of years was transforming into something new. The megafauna were facing a crisis that had nothing to do with humans. They were adapted to one world, and that world was disappearing. When humans arrived, they didn't find a pristine paradise waiting to be destroyed. They found an ecosystem already under stress, teetering on the edge. And humans, being humans, definitely pushed things over that edge. Through hunting, sure, but also through their use of fire to modify landscapes. Their competition for resources, and their introduction of new pressures that animals already struggling couldn't adapt to fast enough. The megafauna extinctions happened relatively quickly in geological terms within a few thousand years of human arrival. Megalania, the marsupial lion, the giant kangaroos, the Diprotodon, all gone. The skies became emptier. The forests became quieter. The food chains collapsed and reassembled into something completely different. Australia went from being the deadliest place on Earth to being just Earth. Dangerous, sure, but manageable, survivable. And here, what really gets me about this story. We can see the ghosts of that ancient world everywhere in modern Australia. Those venomous spiders and snakes that terrify tourists. They're the survivors, the lineages that made it through the apocalypse by being small enough, adaptable enough, toxic enough. The Komodo dragons still hanging on in Indonesia. They're basically mini megalanias, living fossils that remind us what used to patrol these landscapes. Every dangerous creature in modern Australia is a callback to a time when danger was the default setting. The ecology of modern Australia makes so much more sense when you understand what used to live there. Why are wombats so surprisingly aggressive for herbivores? Because their ancestors evolved alongside marsupial lions. Why are kangaroos so bizarrely muscular and combat-ready? Because they descended from giants that had to defend themselves against predators that make modern dingoes look like puppies. The environment shaped these animals, and even though the megafauna are gone, their evolutionary pressure is still encoded in their descendants' DNA. What's even more fascinating is thinking about what could have been. What if humans had never arrived, or arrived later? Would megalania still be prowling Australian forests? Would we have safari tours where you could observe marsupial lions from the safety of reinforced vehicles? Would Australia have remained the most terrifyingly dangerous place on Earth? We'll never know, but it's wild to think about how different the world would look. There is something profound about realizing that the deadliest period in Australia's history was during some ancient era of dinosaurs or primitive life forms, but relatively recently, practically yesterday, in geological terms. These were modern ecosystems, operating under modern conditions, just with different players. And those players were absolutely cracked. The thing is, this story isn't just about Australia. It's about how quickly things can change, how fragile even the most successful ecosystems can be, and how the arrival of one new species can completely reshape millions of years of evolutionary history. Every continent had its megafauna moment. Everywhere had its giants. But Australia's was special because they evolved in complete isolation, becoming something unique that the world had never seen before and will never see again. When you walk through the Australian outback today, stepping carefully to avoid snakes and spiders, remember that you're walking on ground that once trembled under the footsteps of 3-ton marsupials. When you see a Komodo dragon in a zoo, you're looking at a watered-down version of something that used to hunt with venom and patience. When you watch a kangaroo box, you're re-seeing combat skills refined over millions of years of facing down predators that would give modern lions nightmares. The legacy of the deadliest place on Earth lives on in ways most people never realize. Australia. Modern animals are unjust dangerous because they happen to be venomous or aggressive. They re-dangerous because they survivors of an era when being anything less than lethal meant being dead. They carry forward the genetic memory of a time when this continent was evolution's Thunderdome, where only the most innovative, most efficient, most absolutely metal creatures could survive. And maybe that's the real lesson here. Australia wasn't the deadliest place on Earth because it was cursed or unlucky. It was deadly because it was successful, because evolution had millions of years in isolation to perfect the art of survival, to create an ecosystem so finely tuned that everything in it was optimized for either killing or not being killed. That's not failure. That's nature at its most impressive, most terrifying, most awe-inspiring peak. So yeah, modern Australia might try to kill you with its spiders and snakes and jellyfish, but trust me, you got off easy. You missed the era when just stepping outside meant potentially encountering a 23-foot venomous lizard, being dive-bombed by eagles the size of small aircraft, or becoming lunch for a marsupial that looked like a wombat's fever dream. History bit back hard on this continent, and the scars are still visible if you know where to look.